Today's game is a blitz game between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja, the Chess24 Banter Blitz. And as we know, Magnus has been world champion for a long time. Alireza Firouzja, as a recording of this video, is third in the world. So this is a very elite chess. Let's jump right in. Magnus with the white pieces, Firouzja with the black. Magnus plays d4, knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6, a queen's gambit declined, and after knight to c3, Firouzja plays bishop to b4. This is known as the Ragozin Defense, and basically it tries to combine the solidity of a queen's gambit declined, a solid position, but also with the unbalanced positions you get in a Nimzo Indian, trying to have your cake and eat it too. Pawn takes pawn, bishop to g5. Now, if Magnus can play e3, bishop to d3, and castles without his position being disturbed, he's going to have a good position. So Firouzja with black has to find a way to mix things up a little bit. Castles e3, and he plays h6, immediately asking a question of the bishop. Bishop goes to h4, and then he plays the bishop to f5, so that Carlsen's bishop cannot comfortably develop at d3, or it would just get exchanged. The other way that black attacks this position is with the move c5, by the way. So here he plays bishop to f5. The one downside is it leaves this b7 pawn a bit vulnerable. It's now undefended, and Carlsen plays queen to b3, immediately taking aim at that now undefended b7 pawn. Firouzja takes the knight, queen takes, g5, hits the bishop, bishop g3, and knight to e4. So you see how Firouzja is keeping Carlsen from getting comfortable. He's offering threats. He's keeping him occupied. He can't just develop his pieces naturally. Now here Carlsen plays the move queen to a3. Now he could just take on c7, and that wins a pawn, but actually Firouzja is fine after that capture. He just plays knight to c6, just develops normally. Carlsen cannot take the b7 pawn because after queen to a5 check, and the king would have to move, and his king is just going to get torn apart. Black is just winning here. And if he exchanges queens, rook takes, and even though black's down a pawn, he just plays knight to b4, rook a to c8, and he easily has full compensation for a pawn. So what Magnus does instead is he plays the queen to a3. He knows that the move c5 is a key source of counterplay for black, and he also knows the move queen to a5 check can become a problem. So a3 is prophylaxis against both of those moves. Knight goes to c6, bishop to b5. Magnus is threatening to just take the knight with the bishop, move the rook to c1, aiming at the doubled pawns. Firouzja cannot have that, so he moves the knight away. Knight to d2. Now, this is an interesting decision, a risky decision by Carlsen, because if Firouzja just takes the knight on d2, Carlsen has to retake with his king, and his king is now in the center of the board. What he's saying is the knight at e4 is so powerful, it's worth going ahead and getting rid of it, even if it means leaving the king in the center. Firouzja responds with c6, hitting the bishop. The bishop returns to d3. Now knight takes d2, king takes d2, bishop takes bishop, queen takes. So here, Carlsen's king's in the middle of the board, but as compensation, he has the better minor piece, I would say. I think the bishop at g3 is better than the knight on e7, and also these h6 and g5 pawns leave black's structure a little weak. So a bit better minor piece, a little bit better structure, but king in the middle of the board. Queen to a5 check, the king moves to e2, and what Firouzja is going to try to do is strike in the center as quickly as he can before Carlsen has a chance to get his king away from the action. So f5, he wants to open up lines with the f4 move his other rook to e8 and attack that king. Bishop to d6 to get out of that threat of f4. Rook a to e8. And now Carlsen plays g4. He wants to get this f5 pawn out of the way so his own queen would have access to the squares around black's king. Rook to f6 helps control g6 a little bit, but mostly takes aim at the bishop that is at d6. And Carlsen plays the move bishop to e5. A better move might have been just taking the knight, and after rook takes h4 to try to open up lines on the king's side. But this move, bishop to e5, despite its normal and strong appearance, is actually a blunder. It's a blunder because of Firouzja's brilliant response in this position. He ignores the threat against his rook and instead plays the move knight to g6. If he plays passively, like with rook to f7, after h4, white would be fine. But after knight to g6, if Carlsen grabs the rook, then boom, knight to f4 check, forking the king and the queen, and the pawn cannot take the knight because it is pinned by the rook at e8, a very nasty threat that turns the tide of the game. So in response, Carlsen plays h4, and now knight takes e5, and it turns out that this is not the most precise move. Computer analysis shows that this gives up most of black's advantage. The right move here was fg4. This is a very hard move for humans to see. This is a computer analysis. But after pawn takes, rook takes e5, pawn takes, knight to e5, hitting the queen. And when the queen moves, queen to a6 check, forcing the king to d1, and then rook to f3. And black's pieces are so active here. He has a minor piece and a pawn for a rook, but his piece activity is swarming. After gh6, one sample line is to just play g3. And if he takes the pawn, this is actually a forced mate. Rook f1, rook takes, knight to f3, and after king to c3, queen to c4, checkmate, just as an example of how much danger white's king would be in that position. Knight takes bishop, though, was the move played in the game. Pawn takes knight, and rook takes pawn. And for the moment, black has won a pawn. And white's king is still in the middle of the board, but white has the ability to open up the h-file and create problems of his own. Pawn takes, rook to h5, aiming at the g5 pawn. Firouzja plays queen to b4, threatening queen to g4 check, and also hitting the bishop at b2, which would be taken with check. So rook to g5 check feels like it's forced. The king has to move, king to f7, now b3, so the b2 pawn cannot be taken. And then queen to f4. And this is an amazing move, right? So this move looks like a decisive move, like the game is over, black wins, because there's essentially nowhere that white's g5 rook can go. None of the squares along the file. And if he plays, let's say, rook to h5, then just queen g4 check, and he wins the rook. If rook takes f5, same story. Queen to g4, and the rook falls. The only move to save white's position is this really hard to find move, queen to c3, basically countering attacking this rook, so that when black takes on g5, Carlsen could take on e5, and he would be in good shape. But instead, he plays this move, queen to f5. Now, black has a lot of captures here and a lot of ways to go wrong. If Firouzja, say takes the queen with the f-rook, then just rook takes check, rook takes, and pawn takes queen, and white's in great shape. If he instead takes with the e-rook, then the same story, just pawn takes queen, and he's in great shape. But what Carlsen does is he takes on f5 with his own queen, and this, as it turns out, is a terrible blunder, and Firouzja plays the right move that wins the game for black. Do you see it? That's right. Queen takes rook. And now Firouzja is completely winning. He's simply up a rook after queen takes, rook takes. Now, this is a blitz game, and Carlsen decided to play on, even though he's down a rook for a pawn here. So I'll just go through these moves very, very quickly. Advances. He's hoping maybe he can generate something, you know, with these two pawns, but it's not really possible. The king moves over to keep the rook from checking. And now Firouzja plays a very key move. He plays d4. And what that does is it breaks up this pretty pawn chain and leaves the pawns very vulnerable. Pawn takes, moves a bit. So now he's just up a rook. And basically, all Firouzja has to do is trade off one pair of rooks, and the game is easily won. It's amazing how long Carlsen holds on, though, in this position. Go through the moves here. has a potential to create a passed pawn on the queen side, which he does. After a4, pawn takes. And now it's just a matter of moments. King b3, rook to b1 check. He just blocks that check. King moves, forcing move to b1, and then rook to d2, and now the rooks will be exchanged. And rook to d1 mate. So not much after that move where the rook is won, but up to that point, very interesting chess. I hope you've enjoyed this game, and see you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.